Thank you very much for this very warm welcome. It's great to be here again, and I hope you will find today's talk interesting. I must mention this paper we're co-authoring with my colleague in University of Surrey, Victoria Redcliffe. She's not here at the moment. And I want to give a brief outline of the talk. First of all, I'm going to talk about the research motivations and approach, because this was an interesting project that we developed under the Balkan Futures research project. I will then talk about different literatures concentrating on places, identities, borders, and liminality. I will then talk about my data, present selected parts of my data. In particular, I'm going to show two stories, two border narratives that refers to current times, so young people traveling and current times when the border between Turkey and Greece is relatively more permeable. And these case studies are selected among many to indicate in a short period of time the diversity of experiences that the borders contain. And then I want to highlight 5 stories in particular about young people traveling across this border in 70s when the conflict between, or the tension between Turkey and Greece was at peak. And the borders were, for that reason, relatively impermeable. And it's created some effects on the region, but also on the life courses of these individuals who are traveling at a time when they're trying to build their own identity, they're trying to construct their life projects. And I'll conclude. In terms of research motivations and approach within the perspective of the Balkan Futures, our starting point was regional development and cooperation. However, as pointed out very nicely by Becsev in his thesis, Balkans is characterized by prolonged historical process of fragmentation. So much so that the term Balkanization in English language is used to refer to divide a whole into smaller hostile groups. And it's used, for instance, how when a scholarly discipline gets into smalling fighting units and becomes less productive as a result. From that perspective, regional cooperation and Balkanization sounds like they're the antitheses of each other. And we can think of regional cooperations in the Balkans almost as an oxymoron. However, Becsev in his thesis showed that all these projects aiming for cooperation in the Balkans had indeed had an impact, trying to create cross-border interactions. When we look at Thrace more specifically, Greek-Turkish relations and other Cold War dynamics prohibited from time to time the cross-border flows, which is, from some perspectives, led to an arrested development in the region. So the region has become poorer and less connected, which is a bit tragic in the context of history when we think of Thrace, which exists for almost 3 millennia as a region which is very famous for most of this time as strong interactions and always being a place where East meets the West. So the motivation of this research was to understand what is happening in real life, in people's experiences, in terms of mobility and barriers between Turkey and Greece. And I employed a grounded theory perspective, as mentioned in my general research trajectory, which means that I did not start from the literature on Balkans or even literature on regional development in general, but freshly from experiences and perspectives of individuals. For being able to do that, I traveled between Istanbul and Thessaloniki and spoke with people who are traveling on the bus between these two destinations. I had to limit the research to Turkish-speaking travelers, unfortunately, just because I do not speak Greek. So this story here reflects partially the story of the border. I'm going to highlight, as mentioned, 5 individuals' border narratives in particular, and based on their story, I will try to build a better understanding of the role of state power in more specifically the state power applied in border making, on everyday mobility experiences, so what happens every day out there, but also in more long-term perspective, the life courses and identities of individuals, and on a more general perspective, the spatial continuity of social reality across borders. So how, in usual, social reality continues. Just because you put a border there, it doesn't mean people's connections disappear. However, state power has a constitutive role which can change that, as we'll see in these examples. More generally, the contribution of this work on identity construction literature is as follows. We see identity construction as part of the literature review we've done for the study as a complex and multi-level process which is both quintessentially personal, which we can argue from a perspective that perhaps nothing else is more personal than the construction of your own identity. But at the same time, it's entirely social, so we can never imagine construction of identity in a vacuum, in isolation from shared meanings that is given to facets of a person's identity. It's also interesting that it's a discursive process, so we narrate a lot about who we are. Like we can say, as we've just done, I'm a good person, but I'm also a fair person in our dialogues with other people. But it's also a very experiential process, so we manifest who we are with our actions, and we're quite reflexive about whether these two match with each other from time to time. In this study, we focus on a very special case which focuses on place identities, border crossing, and border talk. And we argue that these subjects relate to both of these axes of identity construction. It refers to personal social dimension, but also discursive experiential distinctions. I want to refer to a selective literature on a very broad range here, because we're referring to really lots of topics, but I'm selecting work that relates most to our data as part of the granted theory perspective. So I'm going to write a lot on Giden's approach to identity construction, which is one of the classical approach that is taught for sociology students nowadays. So according to Giddens, and he has a very critical perspective of how individual is burdened with construction of his identity in modernity, he argues identity construction and the self in general in high modernity or late modernity in his conception becomes a reflexive project that each individual is responsible of. Everyone is now not whom they're born as, but what they make of themselves through the development from their understanding of their past to an anticipated future. In this sense, a life course can be seen as a series of passages, and we must remember each passage involves loss as well as gain. During this process, individuals are expected to be continuously reflexive about who they are and narrate about that. And self-actualization, which is given a high importance in our age, is in a way taking control of one's life. And that means taking control or trying to take control of time. It also involves, very importantly, a balance between opportunity and risk. So even though you're given a lot of agency through construction of your identity, you're also given a lot of responsibility. Giden in his book talks a lot about how institutional contexts actually do not allow many individuals to create an infinite options of building their identity. So there's a hidden clash there that individuals are supposed to take the risk of not fulfilling their full potential. After these critical observations, he says, in practice, identity construction happens through our lifestyles, so everyday habitual experiences that we create. And in terms of time, life planning and trying to develop yourself constantly becomes important themes. I think I mentioned the limitations here. So the usual discourse sets a picture as if you are in charge of your destiny. However, often opportunities for different groups of people and different places, I want to stress here, is different. It's not always limitless. So if you refer a little bit to a completely different literature now about space, place, and identity dynamics, we must mention Tuan's conception about places. He argues that space is an abstract concept, but we humans make it into places as we get and experience these places. In that context, while space is what makes movement possible, a place is a house. And for Ralph, therefore, to be human is to live in a world that is filled with significant places. To be human is to have and know your place. These two classical accounts see places as a more confined, protected area. For instance, when we think of home, we think of places like that. In more recent literature, though, authors highlight that places should be envisaged more like spatial entities that are open to interaction. So people's agency has an effect on places. By accommodating, I want to insert a little bit of Guidon's notion of self-construction in places here. By accommodating certain lifestyles more than others, places become part of people's self-projects. In turn, manifestations of such lifestyles influence the meanings of places. Another note about identity construction literature, again referring to critically to modernity, is the concept of national identity and nationness. And I want to refer to Anderson here, who says, despite appearing to be an artifact of modernity, national identity, or nationness, what he calls, is assigned both a profound emotional legitimacy and a formal universality. But the first one, what he means is that it creates a strong bond for the individual in defining himself or herself, so much so that at times of crisis, a big sacrifice like losing your life is expected from you due to this bond that you build with the nation. With the concept of formal universality, Anderson argues that it's also given a job as if everyone in modernity must have a national identity. As such, the concept of nation also bases a moral framework in which individuals understand and make sense of the spatio-political organization of the world. In other words, the concept of nation makes the spatial and political organization of current world legitimate for us. From that perspective, he defines nation not as something that existed forever out there or exists even now, but more as an imagined political community with borders beyond which one fittingly imagines other nations. So I want to organize and summarize everything we've seen so far with 3 words: roots, and borders. So overall, reproduction of social action in particular places suggests some continuity in meanings of places, and we refer to this continuity, this element, in common metaphor of one's roots. Then again, people can move, and movement and mobility provides options. But then again, movement is also structured like space. People do not move into random destinations, but there are patterns from destinations, from origins to destinations, as in common expressions like migration or mobility routes. As some people move across these routes and others remain where they are, experiences, including those of inclusion and exclusion, affect senses of places. In other words, people do not just happen to be or chose to be where they are, but in some cases they're made to be where they are. Borders and social boundaries of different kinds are usually established, maintained, or challenged through forces and power of different kinds. When it comes to national borders, we talk of the power of the nation state. Hence, places and identities are continuously made sense of by the roots, and borders that construct and disrupt them. I want to talk a little bit about borders and how complex they are as well, referring to different parts of borders literature here. So one dimension of complexity comes from the fact that nations, economies, cultures do not share the same shapes. And once within this object, we don't see a unitary object as well. Inevitably, borders both cut through and breach communities of different kind. And this places cross-border mobility at the central place for some communities. Another dimension of complexity comes from the fact that due to this richness and diversity, there are lots of things happening at the real life, so the bottom-up dynamics. And states apparatus try to react to this by top-down institutions, but there's almost always a time gap between these two, so they're not in sync with each other. And with increasing institutional and technological complexity, we can think of borders today no longer as passive barriers, but as asymmetric membranes, instruments of power, ordering flows, and including people. So these membranes are now ranking people in terms of their origin, coming from rich versus poor country, in terms of their skill, highly versus or low-skilled individuals. So there's an ordering going on through these membranes. And as pointed out by Prokola, both these technological changes, but also historical and political transitions, lead to each generation creating their own border narratives. I now want to refer lastly to two concepts. One is coming from anthropology and the concept of liminality. I'm referring to these two concepts because they're useful in shedding light to understanding our data. So Turner, extending Van Gennep's concept of rites of passage, suggested that a person passes from one identity state to another through a process of liminality. In his view, the liminar threatens the established categories of the majority or the other people that are not liminar. For that reason, he or she is socially invisible, considered not pure, and often has no rights. He or she, during the process of liminality, just like identity construction, reflects on society and cosmos before returning back to society with a clearer identity. So this has some references to people who are liminal across borders. But another related concept is about the literature on borderlands. Although my case study is not about a borderland, but a more broad geographical region covering an important part of Thrace, I think these notes are also important, helping us to understand this data. So it is shown in empirical studies that identity building in borderlands is complicated because people have access to more than one set of identity narratives, and they can choose and build their own mixes out of these narratives. And as such, the borderlands are very rich places to study and understand identity narratives and to be critical about these narratives. And permeability of the border affects how rich these narratives or repertoire can be, as again shown in empirical studies. What I suggest here, putting liminality and borderlands literature together, is that perhaps in the case of border talk and border studies, we can talk of not rites of passage, but places of passage. As people travel among these places that are significant for them, they're moving from one facet of their identity towards another. And this kind of fits into Giden's perception of life being a series of passages as well. So, in the light of all this, new perspectives, but it has been going on for a couple of decades now, so it's not as new, doesn't see borders as a fixed, stable, physical entity which shows where nation begins and ends, but a set of institutions, processes, technologies, social practices, and discourses around legality and legitimacy of states as spatial organizations. Or from a different point of view, it suggests seeing borders as critical and seeing them as social and political actors. And here I'm referring to Rumford's analysis, but he mentions a concept that is a bit unclear to me. He suggests we should see borders like border instead of seeing them as a state. I understand what he's referring to. We should not talk about borders unquestionably as if states think about them in terms of their functions, but more critically in thinking about what they change and shape and their constitutive nature in social and political life. In that respect, border studies aim to pay attention to meanings of borders in the construction, organization, and reproduction of social and cultural life. It is argued that due to all this richness in everyday life, it cannot be studied without covering individuals' perspectives and what's happening in their day-to-day experiences. One way of doing this is border narratives, yet still in literature, the narratives of ordinary people, so not influential individuals, but ordinary people, are a bit underrepresented. So this is where we start our contribution to this literature. Our fieldwork covers 30 interviews, and participants were a mixed group. I traveled during different seasons to cover a range of experiences, and participants were tourist guides, workers on the bus, or travelers on the bus journey between the two cities. They were mixed in age and gender. They include Turks of Western Thrace as well as Turkish tourists and business people. The narratives of Turks of Western Thrace were particularly rich because of the reasons that we just explored, and informative about the Greek-Turkish border and how it influences everyday practices of people and communities. Having strong ties on both sides of the border, Turks of Western Thrace are betwixt and between the border. They are liminal. I will now first present stories of two participants who are now in their 20s, and these are selected from many other cases because they're symbolically rich and interesting. But what I'm trying to show here is life stories when border is more permeable. So first story is about Jada, who is traveling to Greece to visit her mother and friends. Her mother is Greek and her father is Turkish, and they got divorced when she was young. And her father went back to Turkey, and Jada stayed with her mom in Western Thrace. But then when she became 18, she decided to convert to Islam without telling anyone. And without telling anyone part was important for her, and I think important for us in terms of her taking control of her life course. She also started to wear headscarf, and her mother respected her decision. She was, when she was talking to me, positive and enthusiastic about opportunities both in her hometown and in Istanbul. But looking about opportunities in both places, she fell in love with Istanbul, in her words, and she decided to live there. And she was taking courses, hoping to study at the university and find a job later on in Istanbul. So what was interesting about her case was also all the symbolisms about, my observations about her. When we were waiting at the border, because the bus stops in between two borders, and there's a little duty-free shop, and we went to the duty-free shops like everyone else together with her, but then she showed me shops towards the back of the building that most people do not see. We entered a souvenir shop where she asked if they had a bigger Turkish flag than the one they had on display. So she ended up buying a huge Turkish flag, and she was trying to see how big it is at the border. For me, it's had a lot of symbolisms. At the end of the break at the border, I was spending time with other travelers. We were called back on the bus, but she wasn't around, and it was in the middle of the night, so I was worried about her. And I found her again around the shops. She said, I bought a very nice belly dancing costume and at a very cheap price. These are very expensive at Grand Bazaar. Previously, I bought 2 there. Do you wear or just collect them? I ask hesitantly, partly also because of her lifestyle choices. And she says, yes, at home. I dance for my friends, but then she smiles and adds, and for my boyfriend. So clearly, Jada is able to reach to a variety of experiences and opportunities to build and to find where she belongs. There's another couple, again a young couple, traveling to Greece visiting the woman's parents. So the pseudonyms I gave for them are Maria and Ilhan. Their story started, very interestingly, when they were teenagers. Ilhan was working in a small company and their boss wanted to reward them with a small trip into Western Thrace. And Ilhan and Maria met during this journey. They kept in touch for a while, and they had a romantic relationship for a while, but then they lost track of each other. And the places literature nowadays discusses quite a lot the virtual space and how relationships are carried there. Therefore, I found this story quite informative. As young adults, they were both spending considerable time playing Warcraft, and one day they realized they were playing against each other. You know, it's very unlikely what happened in this case. And they decided to see each other again, thinking we keep meeting each other anyway, and eventually got married. And their current life. They live in an industrial city in Turkey near Istanbul, where he works and she spends most of her time at home. So the life for mixed couples today is not without problems either. The plan was for her to learn Turkish and be more integrated to life in Turkey. It didn't quite work out like that, Ilhan explains. We always go everywhere together, he adds, otherwise she stays at home. It's also difficult to always communicate in English. If I see that she will not learn Turkish for sure, I'll start learning Greek. Then again, the point I'm trying to make here is that although there are difficulties in their life as well, they're open to create different versions of their relationship and their life courses. Whereas we'll see that these kind of options are contrasting quite a bit from the cases where borders were quite impermeable. So the first border narrative is from İsmet, who is a Greek citizen who now works at a Turkish university. He grew up in a town in Western Thrace, wondering what Turkey is like, as he tells me, as most of his peers were. And as he grew older, he felt alienated in Greece, and this led him to a search of his own identity in Turkey. His first visit to Turkey, like many of his peers, was a journey that he took alone as a teenager to study in Istanbul. His account of both Greece and Turkey was first shaped with how places of historical importance were treated. I'm summarizing, unfortunately, a little bit of his story, but it's an important quote here that he gives us. When I first saw the houses around the historical walls in Istanbul, I thought this was disrespectful to historian culture. I knew this feeling from Thessaloniki. We went to movies with friends. Later we learned that movie theater was previously a mosque. It was standing as it was, but it was used as a movie theater. So the first experience in terms of his identity search in Turkey was disappointment. And he remembered this feeling. This feeling actually connected his experiences of identity search in Greece and Turkey to each other. What he was looking for in Greece and in Turkey was not just the opposite, or perhaps revenge of what he felt in Greece, but being accounted for, being respected for both aspects of his identity, and he didn't find that. İsmet stayed in Turkey for a couple of years after his studies and decided to return to Greece, traveling by ferry. At border control, he learned from the officer checking his passport that he lost his Greek citizenship due to Article 19. For those of you who doesn't know what Article 19 is, it was one of the border-making apparatus used by the Greek state. It was an article that allowed Ministry of Internal Affairs, by the suggestion of a national committee, to denationalize minority members who leave the country with the intention of no return. The intention of no return was decided quite subjectively. For instance, if you sold your property in Greece, or if you took all your family members, or if you stayed a long period of time, that could be interpreted as intention of no leave. And between 1955 and 1998, about 60,000 people, most of which are of Turkish origin, lost their Greek citizenship. Returning back to the story, the border control officer told him there's nothing you can do about it. He offered as a favor, but according to İsmet, also as a solution to what to do with him, not confiscating his passport so that he could return to journey with the same ferry. He recommended not telling the Turkish officers that he had become a stateless person, for avoiding the risk of not being accepted to Turkey either, because then he would be stranded on the ferry. He wouldn't be accepted to both countries. Because, adds Ismet, Turkey was trying not to make it easy for Greece to denationalize Turks. Thus, just like that, Ismet was left on a ferry, very symbolically again, on the Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey, stateless and trying to find a way out of his now invalid, trying to find a way out with his now invalid passport. He was also left alone within the policies and contingencies of the two countries about minorities. Later, with the advice and great support of his Greek friends in Greece, Ismet managed to enter the country flying from Switzerland, because in that borders they did not suspect the validity of his passport, so he could enter the country. And once he was in Greece, again with the help of his friends, he resisted deportation, repeating what his lawyers advised to numerous policemen who paid visits to his home. And eventually, he won his legal battle. And this was a very politically active individual. I cannot tell more about his story because then it would really reveal his identity. But that's a case like that. Now we see another individual traveling about the same age, about the same time to Turkey. Murat is a Turkish citizen living in Istanbul. He was born and grew up in a village near Zanti. For him, Istanbul was a passion from early on. Even at the age of 9-10, I was in love with Istanbul. I could not think of anything else. I didn't listen to my parents or anybody. When I was 16, so when he was in love with Istanbul, he has never seen it actually. So it's a different kind of place attachment to an imagined place in his case. When I was 16, I came to Istanbul to study. I was very happy to finally reaching my Istanbul. I was in peace. I still am. Then, at the age of 20, Murat found himself at a point of decision. It didn't make sense to enter Turkey with a passport each time, so I said to myself, either martyr or veteran, which is a Turkish saying meaning there's no return. There's no returning back. I left Greek citizenship and acquired Turkish one. I am now Turk, son of a Turk, and I will die like this. I want to point out here that he's acquiring a Turkish citizenship and leaving Greek citizenship had nothing to do about the identity of his parents. So his notion of I'm now Turk, son of a Turk, is more about the clarity of his identity and the convenience that comes with it. Regarding places, because we're referring to place attachments in this study as well, while we're traveling towards Turkey, he points out to the untouched seashore along the way, close to the Turkish border, and says, "You see how beautiful these places are, but sadly there is no initiative to put any developments here." And he's sadly referring to concrete hotels and services that I would dread to see in that shore. But in his perspective, that was the development of places. If this was in the Turkish side, there would be lots of hotels. There would be lots of hotels and buildings here. It would be like paradise. Then again, in somehow contradiction with his view, Murat also explains not being able to sleep in his beloved Istanbul anymore due to crowd and noise. The village he grew up is thus a frequent escape for Murat and his family. He can truly relax only in the village with clean air and proper food, and their old neighbors always happy to offer lots of food to them. So for Murat, there are two escapes. He escapes from his village in Zanti to his Turkish identity, but then he escapes there to Zanti again nowadays. So he has a different type of liminality by the help of current permeability of the borders. Now, as quickly as possible, I'll go through 3 examples of female travelers. Selma is a Turkish citizen now living in Istanbul. She was born and grew up in Zanti, and like Ismet, he mentions feeling alienated in Greece as a young person, and like Murat, she feels strongly connected to Turkey, so she doesn't have any doubts about her identity at the moment. In this region, because we're traveling in the Greek part of Greece now, no matter what, there's a feeling of alienation, but our land, Turkey, is something else, something truly else, and this refers to a popular song by My Country is Something Else song. For Selma, losing her Greek citizenship was neither an imposition nor a decision, but a compromise. When she married a Turkish citizen and moved to Turkey, she knew this would mean losing her citizenship according to Article 19. The major effect of losing her Greek citizenship in Selma's life was not being left stateless like it was for Ismet, but not being able to go back to Greece at all for over 2 decades. So he was not able to visit her parents, and her 2 children grew up not ever seeing their grandparents or the places that their mother grew up and feel so connected to. She explains that being completely detached from Greece and her loved ones for such a long time was a major pain and burden for her. This is a theme that is repeatedly appearing in place attachment literature as well, but because he was not able to go back, that attachment was becoming a burden for her. I miss the places where I was born and grew. I was always seeing those places in my dreams. As I said, I couldn't go for 22 years. When I went there after 22 years, I felt a relief, a big relief. My mother is old now, you see, but it's much easier now. So the second female participant is a Greek citizen living in Komotini. She also lived and worked for years in Istanbul, where she has family, including her sister and friends. So she is well connected in both parts. Her first journey was Turkey, was quite traumatic and reminds us the risk and opportunity literature Giddens draws upon. It was a journey that she took when she was 12 years old. She was put into a taxi to Istanbul, being accompanied by an elderly Greek neighbor. She was going to join her sister to study in Istanbul. She remembers that she started crying at Komotini and never stopped the whole journey. When entering Aksaray, part of Istanbul, there is a big apartment building, and on that apartment was an advertisement of Vatan canned foods. When I saw that, I had never seen a billboard and a building that was 23 floors so big. She thought, where am I? I thought to myself, I'm lost. I felt myself like the smallest piece of dust in this big city. So it was quite traumatic, both in terms of traveling alone, but the scale of the city compared to the places that she's used to. For Hülya, her studies in Istanbul, which provided her now a good career in performing arts that she enjoys very much, was too challenging at the time for her age. And she describes the impermeability of the borders quite vividly here. In the past, there were strict rules. I remember the bridge at the border. Greek bus would stop at one side, and the Turkish bus would wait at the other side. We had to walk that bridge with all our belongings. At the age of 13, your mother puts lots of meals, jams, and whatnot with you. My arms were getting longer while carrying them all along that bridge. They wouldn't let us bring money. I tell you, this route has experienced that a lot. There were shiny American cups and blankets from Maura. I couldn't decipher what Maura is, but blankets were coming from there. We put those cups inside the blankets. We had to sell those in Istanbul for pocket money. And İsmet refers to the same selling of jeans, blankets, and cups. This is the last story, and it's kind of the most difficult story to study. Gülay is a Greek citizen, now living in a border town in Turkey, taking care of her mother who is unwell. Her mother is a Turkish citizen. She grew up in a village near Komotini with her 2 brothers. The family decided to migrate to Turkey when Gülay was a teenager. So unlike all other stories, the travel we have here was the whole family traveling together in pursuit of a new life. In time, both of her parents and brothers acquired Turkish citizenship and leaving Greek citizenship, balancing the needs and benefits based on contingencies of their new lives in Turkey. Gülay, on the other hand, remains a Greek citizen. She remembers her border narrative relates quite a lot to the Turkish community she grew up in, a close-knit, hardworking, and generous village. Her fondest memories include children of the village, including herself, moving around houses and gardens of the village as they like, finding all doors unlocked and always welcomed with frequent offerings of snacks. However, the community was also quite close to non-Turks. She explains that they were discouraged from interacting with Greeks. Thus, despite living in Greece, she never learned Greek until later years of schooling. While her brothers continued their education thereafter, after they traveled to Turkey, they migrated to Turkey, going to university when the family migrated, but she was not given the same chance. So here we draw upon the gender issues relating identity construction. Her future, unlike her successful brothers, depended on making a good marriage. She married a man from Turkish trace, which was very important in their choice of partner, believing that he would be a person of our region, but he turned out to be very different, quote unquote, very different. The couple divorced after several years of heavy alcohol use and domestic violence. Gülay refers to a similar reasoning, so understanding people by where they are, when she refers to events that happened later on in her life. For example, she makes sense of a tragedy, a family tragedy, through her brother's wife who is coming from Eastern Turkey. According to Gülay, when their father passed away, under the influence of his Eastern wife, tried to sell their family house even though Gülay and her elderly and sick mother had nowhere to go. So they legally stopped this process and they can live there. But Gülay is quite stranded because she cannot take her Turkish mother back to Greece, and she is not Turkish citizen either. Moreover, although the Article 19 is suspended in 1998, she still has the trauma. So every 6 months, she leaves her elderly mother with her neighbors and travels to friends in Komotini just so that her passport is stamped and she shows connections, continuing connections to Greece. So she's still afraid of losing her Greek citizenship. So I want to first, in conclusion, make a little bit of summary of the themes we have seen here in these cases. From reservation of historical places to commercial development of idyllic settings, the participants negotiate the use of space as part of their identity narratives. From the long-lasting childhood memory of the imposing scale of canned-full billboards to the childhood village that is longed for decades, places had impact on realizations of life projects. Border in the story is also important with its legal, practical, and symbolic associations, indicating clearly the shift between two parts of participants' lives. At times the border is impermeable, its impact on liminality becomes problematic for forcing individuals to halve their lives in one way or another. This problem is dealt differently by different individuals. From idyllic settings of closely knit but closed and imposing communities to feeling alienated in more mixed settings, participants had different belongings in Greece. Similarly, the extent they resolved their issues by exploring less complicated lives in Turkey varied between participants. This variation touches upon the expectations of being respected in both accounts versus leaving Greece in past between Ismet and Murat. It also depends a little bit about their worldviews and political actions. Very broadly speaking, Gülay and Selma's stories bifurcated with happy and unhappy marriages. Gülay's story also departs from Hülya's through having access to education, despite the way it was experienced so traumatically at the time. So, in conclusion, identity construction, as we suggested at the beginning, is a personal, social, discursive, and experiential process that is both empowerment of our agency in our times, but also a major responsibility. We are expected to question who we are, plan our life courses, manage our lifestyles, take risks, and make sacrifices to construct who we are. An important aspect of our identity in modernity is our nationality, which is subject to the constitutive power of the state institutions. Border making has a special place in this power as clarifying who is of what nation. Places also have an important part in identity construction by providing us a range of possible identity narratives, providing the range of opportunities, and accommodating certain lifestyles more than others. People have some influence on making of the places, as well as some ability to move between places. In this sense, in relation to Ralph's famous quote, "To be human is to have and know your place," we can argue that to be human in more recent times is to make and find your place. The plurality of significant places and national identities provide liminal people, like our participants, both opportunities and challenges during their identity construction. This confusion, and arguably their very existence in the first place, is also problematic for the idea of the nation, policies and apparatus of the nation state, and everyday classifications of the majority. At the same time, these individuals and their rich collections of identity narratives bond larger groups, us the majority, as well as maintain the spatial continuity of social reality across borders. So in very conclusion, disrupting these varied identity narratives make us all poorer in different ways. And that's where I stop. Thank you very much.